Okay, welcome. Welcome everybody. I don't know if you can you hear me? Yes. No, we can hear you. Welcome to the spring Syracuse Architecture lecture series. It snowed today, spring, quite appropriately. I was having a short conversation with our speaker tonight before, and I observed to him that he solved one problem I have every semester, and that is how to fill the lecture hall for the lectures. The problem is I'll have to have Randall lecture every lecture for the rest of the semester, so maybe we can convince him to do that. Anyway, thank you all for coming tonight. It's a special lecture tonight. It's the kickoff for a special series. It's the kickoff for the spring event. There's a reception afterwards. You probably know that. There's stuff being set up down below. I normally do a very informal introduction, but tonight I'm going to read something a little longer because I write so beautifully. I thought I would just read you something that I've written. Yes, but this is a very, very special occasion, and I'm going to switch the slides for just a second to start this. If it works. Chuck? There. Okay, so Professor Randall Korman is a native of New York City, where he completed his undergraduate professional degree in architecture at the Cooper Union. He later studied for and was awarded a graduate degree in advanced architectural design at Harvard University. From 1972 to 1974, Professor Korman worked as a graduate intern at the Institute for Architecture and Urban Studies, the IAUS in New York City. One, I think, could argue the most important gathering of intellectuals and architects in the latter part of the 20th century, and I think they probably influenced architectural discourse more than anybody else, certainly even today. A very auspicious place to be. Here's a photo of young Korman at one of the IAUS dinners with, among others, Rem Koolhaas, his wife Madeline Riesentorp, Mario Gondolsonas, Julia Bloomfield, Richard Meyer, Kenneth Frampton, Diana Agres, Susanna Frank, Peter Eisman, and many, many others. I'm not sure if you can guess which one is young Korman, but he's in the very back and on the left. Now, in addition to his own firm, Professor Korman worked as an architect in the offices of Kenneth Frampton, who's in this photo, Peter Eisman, who is also in this photo, and Michael Graves. Professor Korman has been a visiting faculty member at the University of Texas and at Kanto Gakuen University in Yokohama in Japan. And in the spring of 2009, he was the Batsa Distinguished Visiting Professor at Colgate University. Most importantly for us, Professor Korman joined the Syracuse Architecture faculty in 1977 and has since taught at all levels of the undergraduate and the graduate programs. Between 1980 and 1982, he established and developed a Syracuse architecture program in Florence, an achievement that had he done nothing else would have secured his place in the Syracuse architecture pantheon. He should get a round of applause just for that. But of course, he did so much more. Professor Korman served as chair of both the undergraduate and graduate architecture programs at Syracuse, and in 1989 he returned to Florence to serve as the resident director of the Syracuse University Florence Center. In 2007, he established the Syracuse University London Architecture Program, and in 2014 we opened in New York City the program at the Fisher Center, due in large part to his considerable efforts to make it happen. Between 2005 and 2012, Professor Korman served as Associate Dean, and between 2012 and 2013 as Interim Dean of the School of Architecture. Professor Randall Korman has been and continues to be the heart and soul of this great school. Every time we meet, whether in casual conversation or in a formal meeting, I learn something important about the school, about architecture, and most importantly, about life itself. And I know that every one of you has had the same experience. As you all may know, Professor Korman will retire at the end of the spring 2018 semester, during which time he will teach a special studio on facades and preside over a special lecture series also on facades. He has invited 5 prominent architects and scholars who have themselves focused their design and scholarly attention on the architectural facade to lecture as part of the spring 2018 school lecture series. His lecture tonight, Facade, Missing in Action, serves as the opening and introductory lecture in that series. And this series, the Facade series, is underwritten by Granoff Architects in Greenwich, Connecticut, and Rich Granoff, who couldn't be here tonight, is one of the many students of Randall Korman's. I won't say any more because I know you don't want to hear me. You want to hear Professor Korman begin to give his lecture tonight. So please join me in thanking Professor Randall Korman for 40 years of service.
Wow. I better be good tonight. Well, thank you all for coming. Can you hear me back there okay? Good. Thank you all for coming out tonight, and it's great to see this place filled up. I guess this is what it's like to be a rock star. No. I want to thank Michael for the introduction. Thank you. And I want to thank Dean Speaks especially for his incredible support of this event, this lecture series, and all the, the good sort of support that he's given to me over the years that he's been here. He's been a great dean. He's someone who I've enjoyed the company of, particularly our conversations that we have from time to time, Michael. So thank you for all of that. I want to also thank the office of Rich Granoff and Rich Granoff himself for the sponsorship of this lecture series. Richard was a student of mine just a few days ago, I think. It seems that way. And when Michael told me that he was sponsoring the lecture series, I was deeply, deeply touched. He was a student of mine, and I'm hoping that all those lessons of those years rubbed off. They seem to have. I also want to dedicate this lecture series to the memory of Thomas Schumacher. Thomas Schumacher was a longtime friend, a colleague, and a fellow façadeaholic. Someone who, you probably are familiar with some of his writings, but probably was one of the most prolific writers about the subject of the facade. I owe much of my own appreciation for the architectural facade to his articles and books that he's written. I had the opportunity recently to read an unpublished manuscript that he was unable to finish before he passed away just a few years ago. And I was reminded again about the great loss of his passing in terms of all the writing that he would have done had he not left so soon. And so I'd like to dedicate this series to Tom. If you will allow me, I'd like to read a brief introduction just to sort of set up the argument that I'm going to make tonight. The phenomenon of the architectural facade has been of particular interest to me since my undergraduate years at the Cooper Union. I can trace my introduction to a specific seminar that I took with a young and little-known architect by the name of Peter Eisenman. The seminar was devoted entirely to the formal analysis and deep read of Renaissance facades. Eisenman's approach, filtered as it was at the time through his then interest in structural linguistics, was like nothing else I had ever encountered before. It planted within me the original seed of curiosity about the nature of the facade as a complex and richly communicative artifact that in many ways is the most important component to a building's agenda of representation. I think it is fair to say that architecture begins at the facade. The nature and the very idea of what a facade is has undergone a fundamental change over the past 25 years. It is a process of change that has been going on for more than 100 years. This lecture and the other 5 in the series are intended to address the phenomenon of the facade in historic, formal, symbolic, and phenomenological terms. The lecturers were selected for their wide range of their perspectives on the subject as manifested in their writing, their teaching, and their practice. What I will try to do today here is to kick off the series with some general observations about the problematic of the contemporary facade and what this means within the current production of architectural form and civic space. As an experiment, try the following. Go home tonight and open any book on architecture and go to the index and look up the word facade. You won't find it. Alternatively, conduct a search for a book that offers a comprehensive overview of the subject of the architectural facade in formal, tectonic, or phenomenological terms. You will find none. That book has yet to be published. The same is true for a broad historical survey, a comprehensive typological study, or a theoretical exposition focused on the subject of the architectural facade. Books of this type don't exist. This would seem strange since historically, most buildings, for better or worse, have a facade, and yet there is a curious lacunae within the disciplinary discourse about the nature and role of the facade as an elemental constituent of the architectural production and the urban landscape. Now, you may be thinking that I'm overstating the issue. Granted, there are numerous articles that deal with the various aspects of the building facade, but these are like finding acorns but not the tree. So how is it that such an important component of the physical environment, the very thing that gives form, scale, character, content to the space of our cities, lacks an attending literature worthy of the subject? I'm not sure I have a precise answer. However, there is something about the subject of the facade that has always been taken for granted. We pay lip service to acknowledging its importance, but there is clearly a curious amnesia evident in much of contemporary architectural discourse about the traditions, the principles, and significance of facade making. For some reason, we seem to avoid a deeper discussion of the issue. This is the case within the profession, within the disciplinary scholarship, and frankly, within the academies. I was pleased to learn that Freshman Studio this year is going to be devoting a module in the studio to the subject of the architectural facade. This is very encouraging to me. Part of the problem is the word itself. Facade is a compromised term that carries with it meanings both precise and ambiguous, positive and negative, modern and retardataire. You may be surprised to know that it is a relatively recent addition to the architectural lexicon, having first appeared in 1756. Prior to that, it didn't exist as a specific architectural term. As counterintuitive as this may sound, you will not find the word facade in Vitruvius's 10 books, in Alberti's De Retificatoria, in Palladio's 4 books, or in Sebastiano Serlio's 7 books of architecture. Not just in the index, but anywhere in the text. It simply is non-existent as an architecturally applied term before 1756. These days, words such as elevation, envelope, screen, and skin are often used incorrectly, I would say, in substitution when referring to facade. Conversely, the word facade is often used equally incorrectly to describe all surfaces of the building. This trend is exacerbated by the fact that there is a contemporaneous drift within dictionary definitions away from the specificity of the front as the site of the facade and towards the generality of any surface, this is problematic for many reasons. For several millennia of building history, the facade was a specifically identifiable, richly articulated, and appropriately celebrated surface. Here are a few examples. These are some of my favorite things. Only to be largely sidelined by the 20th century to the preoccupations of space, preoccupations of volume, space, program, and a reductive abstract aesthetic. Buildings tended to become more self-reflexive. Now, that's not to suggest that this is a bad facade. This is actually a very good facade. And there is a slight echo, an anthropomorphic echo in the facade, as you can see. But the point here is not the issue of abstraction as it is, how does this accommodate the condition of the urban environment? The revival of the facade through postmodernism in the 1970s and 80s was specious and short-lived, quickly discarded in favor of the distractions of deconstructivism, of parametricism, and of blob architecture. More so than ever before, the building envelope has become one of the most complex and multidisciplinary of all building components. As the principal surface of mediation, contextualization, and representation, the facade carries the lion's share of responsibility for containing the internal environment and confronting the outer world. Where the building plan may out of necessity submit to the dictates of structure, program, typology, circulation, and code, the facade is largely free to take on nearly any form and material treatment. In addition to its role as the public face to the public domain, the facade must also serve as an effective interlocutor between the internal pressures of program, space, structure, and environment, and external circumstances of site, climate, orientation, and context, often doing this across a very thin sort of layer. The facade is the first surface one encounters when you approach a building and the last one when departing. It gives shape and scale and color to the urban fabric while serving as backdrop to civic life and social rituals. The facade has the unique capacity to embody the idea of the building as a whole and is the principal instrument by which the architect shapes the observer's impression of it. Very simply, when you think of a building, typically the first thing you think of is its facade. And yet much of contemporary architectural production, the face appears to be missing. All this begs the question of what do we really mean when we say facade? And just as important, what does it mean when it is missing? The answer to the question of what is or is not a facade would seem to be self-evident, but since the early years of the 20th century, the very nature of the vertical surface has brought into question by changes in technology, changes in the idea about form and space, changes in the role of architecture as an instrument for the creation of civic space and symbolic representation. While it is not the objective of this presentation to provide you with a definitive answer to the question of what do we mean by facade, I will try to address some of the issues surrounding these questions and hope that over the course of the lecture series, we may come to a better understanding of what is and is not a facade and why this is important. Thank you for bearing with me on that. I'd like to come at that question of what is or is not a facade sort of obliquely and show you this image of a famous painting by the Belgian surrealist Rene Magritte. You're probably familiar with it. The painting is a photorealistic representation of an object that is fairly common and maybe mundane. And if I were to ask you what it is that you see, you would probably say, I see a pipe. But Magritte, being Magritte, he also added to the painting, as you may know, a declaration at the bottom in French, when translated, says, "This is not a pipe," setting up immediately a kind of dialectic or a contradiction between the words that we read on the bottom and what we see above. He does this purposely for a number of reasons, not the least of which is to bring into question the authority of language versus the authority of an image. And in a way, it is sort of prescient. Because if you think, this was about 1929, I believe, but if you think of what's happened today, how our ability to sort of discern the difference between what is authentic and real and what is an image of that, or what is a representation or a facsimile reproduction, is becoming increasingly more difficult. Consider, for instance, Photoshop. You can't trust photographs any longer. He makes things even more interesting and complicated by adding to the title of it, "The Treachery of Images," suggesting that representation versus the authentic image is to be wary of. Here's a building by Frank Gehry. It's the IAC headquarters in Manhattan. It's on the lower west side. It's on West Side Highway, and it looks out over the Hudson River. So you're seeing now the western elevation of the building. This is south and that's north. Here's a building that has a kind of compelling image. It is, according to Gehry, it was influenced by the sailing ships, the 3- and 4-mast sailing ships that used to ply the Hudson. And so he induced into the building a sense of that relationship to the billowing sails of a ship. He creates what is a fairly, sort of, I would say, run-of-the-mill envelope of the building and wraps the entire structure of that envelope without any deviation, without any acknowledgement of orientation, without any acknowledgement of context. He does make some gestures. You can see that cornice there is attempting to sort of establish a scale relationship to the context. But other than that, the building does not have a facade. This is what the entrance to the building looks like. It's a purely utilitarian sort of door. Clearly, he's not interested in the issue of face as much as he is in the issue of the potential iconic aspect of the building and the landscape. It is very much an object building that has little concern for its urban context. I would say that this is not a facade. Where is Professor Facade? Is he here tonight? So it's an espace une façade. Did I get that right? And so I would add also to my own little sort of declaration or title to this, and that is, be wary of the treachery of envelopes. That we must always make a distinction between envelope and facade. A facade is part of the envelope, but the envelope is not a facade. Now, to be fair to Gehry, he does make facades. Here are a couple of buildings, the Stoddard Robotics Center up in Boston at MIT, and the Fisher Performing Arts Center at Baird College. These have facade properties. And here's another building, a recently completed one by Gehry. This is the Fondation Louis Vuitton in Paris, just outside the historic center in a park. It has no obligation to its context because there are no buildings around it. So it's free to be an object building in the landscape. But even in that context, he does make a facade. And he does that by taking the elements of the building, these white masonry-like towers, and this glass wall that you see there, and collect them together in such a way as to create a space in the front, a public space of arrival, of entry, and then a vertical, almost anthropomorphic-like panel that frontalizes the whole ensemble. So in the context of this object, there is a piece of the facade that he's made above the entrance. So let's, for a moment, consider the contemporary dictionary definition. This is the definition that you will find in almost any dictionary. And it is one that has been the same definition probably for a few hundred years. It says the front of a building, especially an imposing or decorative one. Now, hidden within this is a supposition, a presumption that a building has a front. If it doesn't have a front, then maybe it doesn't have a facade. The idea of imposing or decorative one suggests that, you know, the facade is given some kind of treatment hierarchically that it distinguishes it from the rest of the building. And normally for most buildings with facades, this definition applies. There is a subsidiary definition to it that goes like this: any side of a building facing a public way or space and finished accordingly. Well, this begins to open up the door to the possibility that any surface of a building can be considered a facade. Now, we can admit to the fact that a building can have not only a front facade, but it can have a back facade, or it can have a side facade. But this says that any side of a building could possibly be a facade, but it does have the qualifying requirement that it faces a public way or space. That simply tells us that there is a contingent and codependent relationship between facade and public space. If you take one out of the equation, either the facade or the public space, you lose, presumably, the other. Now, there is a disturbing trend in some dictionaries away from the standard definition. And an authority no less than the Oxford Dictionary of Architecture says this is their definition: external face or elevation of a building, especially the principal facade. This means that you can, if it's not the principal facade, almost any surface can be considered a facade. And I would take issue with that. Now, I brought along my iPad because I think in the context of this age of artificial intelligence, maybe we can ask Siri to give us the most recent updated version of what a facade is. Siri, please define facade.
Facade means the face of a building, especially the principal front that looks onto a street or open space.
She doesn't know either. Let's test the definition using these three buildings. These are buildings that span basically the 20th century. The one on the left is the Hotel Tassel. It's a townhouse, a private townhouse designed by Victor Horta at the end of the 19th century. The one in the middle is by Edward Durrell-Stone, you know, mid-century modern building. And the one on the right is by Herzog and Demeron. It's the Prada showroom in Tokyo. The Victor Horta building, without question, satisfies all of the requirements, the standard historical requirements of what a facade is. It fronts onto a street. It clearly indicates where entry is. There is a kind of hierarchical distribution of the fenestration. In fact, there's a slight echo of a Venetian palazzo in this if you look carefully at the kind of diagram. It's embedded, because it's embedded within the fabric of the context, there's no question that this is the front of the building, that this is a facade. The Edward Durrell-Stone building, however, raises some questions. This is the mid-1950s. All of the trappings of classicism and of history have been stripped out. He presents to us this geometric screen flanked by these two walls, and it appears as though the building, like a book, is being pulled off of the shelf. And so it begins to distinguish itself. It begins to become a much more autonomous condition within the context. However, because it is on an impacted site, because it does face onto the street, in fact, it does contribute to the definition of the street. The reason why it's out here is that the zoning allowed you to build out to the plane of those bay windows that you see there. There's a clear indication of entry. So I would say, for all intents and purposes, as abstract as this is, as reductive as it is still a facade. But what of the Herzog and Demeron building? This is a building where it is not embedded within the fabric of the city. It stands as an autonomous object on a corner site. It doesn't really make space as much as it does occupy space. And it is equivalent on all four sides. There's no one side that one can point to and say that that's the principal face, that is the facade of the building. There is some registration of entry here, albeit a very sort of suppressed one. But other than that, it's hard to say which one of these services qualifies as a facade. This is a building that really celebrates its autonomy, that its idea, its intention is not to present an individual, a principal facade, but rather to be this sort of exquisite object in the landscape. All right, we're at a point where we're still sort of, there's some equivocation about exactly what a facade is. So I thought maybe what we would do is turn to some experts, people who have written extensively about the subject of the facade and who might be able to convey to us some sense of the more nuanced, the more detailed definition of what a facade is. This is Charles Burroughs, who's going to be our next lecturer in a couple of weeks. He says that a facade frames and enhances the point of intersection of interior and exterior space, dividing but also allowing passage between contrasted functional and symbolic realms. That's a rather, I think, very rich way of saying something rather simple, and I can illustrate that with a building that presents a relatively simple condition of facade. This is John Soane's house in London, and it faces onto a park. It presents itself as a limestone box. It's relatively narrow. It's about 3 or 4 feet deep, and it's applied to, it appears to be applied to that brick surface of the building behind. But it's that depth of the building that really illustrates the idea of that zone of transition from the inside to the outside, something that we don't think about as much as we probably should. This, what is sometimes referred to as the liminal condition of transition, of movement from the outside to the inside, and how the facade can serve as an agent for making memorable that moment of transition, of preparing you for the experience that you have when you leave the public realm and you arrive into the private realm, or for that matter, vice versa. And if you've been to Sir John Soane's house, that transition is a memorable one, and what awaits you on the inside is an extraordinary universe of space and things to see in there. It's probably important to understand that the windows that you see, those archways on the second floor, these windows were an alteration to the original building. Originally, the window plane was back at the plane of the bricks, and so that thickness that you see in the doorway was expressed all the way up through 2 stories, such that that liminal zone occurred on both levels. Burroughs again, he writes, the facade then is a place where in service of rhetorical effect, the Kapoor Reality of architecture is compromised. This is a little bit of a chewy statement, but let me see if I can unpack it without overcomplication. By Kapoor Reality, he's referring to how a building presents itself as a body, as a physical artifact, and how that physical artifact has qualities and characteristics that in many ways are expressed through the facade. The sense of mass versus the sense of lightness, porosity versus density, frame-like condition versus a dense block of whatever, or planarity versus volumetric. All of those kinds of conditions of the body of the building are expressed through the facade and these are done for rhetorical effect, to convey to the observer a certain sensibility about the body of the building. An example of that can be seen at the recently completed addition to the Novartis headquarters. This is a pharmaceutical research center at MIT. This was done through a collaboration of Maya Lin and Toshiko Mori. Maya Lin, as you may know, did the Vietnam Memorial in Washington, D.C., and Toshiko Mori did the addition to the engineering building just outside the back of Slocum. What is presented to you is a building that appears to be largely frame-like, stick-like. You see these mullions, the glass wall, it disappears, it appears to disappear behind this wall and reappears up above. So there's a sense But the corpus of the building, the body of the building, is this glazed frame-like structure, and in front of that they have suspended this stone wall. It's literally made of blocks of stone that create this sort of perforated wall effect, and it hangs in space. It literally is suspended in space. That is the rhetorical effect. That is the way in which they've taken the Kapoor Reality of a material that we tend to think of in stereotomic terms, that it's of the earth, it sits on the ground, it's a stone wall. They float this thing up in the air. And they do that through an elaborate sort of scaffolding that you see behind it. You can do this. You can take a stone wall and literally float it in front of a glass facade. Is this a facade? I'm not so sure. I think it is kind of remarkable in the way that it creates this sort of effect, this rhetorical effect, but I'm not so sure it's a facade. The actual entrance of the building, to be fair, is on the other side. So what you're looking at is a side that faces onto Massachusetts Avenue. This is the addition to the National Gallery by Venturi, Rauch, and Scott Brown. It is a wonderful facade. I think it probably is one of Venturi's best facades, and it's the one that sort of illustrates best. I think it exemplifies the principles and practices that he advocated in his book, Complexity and Contradiction. There is much about this building that is complex and contradictory, and I won't take the time to sort of go into it. Suffice it to say that it does, however, represent, the problem, and this is an elegant solution to the problem, of internal pressures versus external obligations that you have. And I mean, a lesson for those students that are here tonight, when you design a facade, always remember that there are two sides to the facade. It's not just the outward face, but it is the inside surface, and that at that meeting point, there are these internal pressures of program, of space, of circulation, of structure, external pressures of site, of context, of orientation, of approach. And that in the hands of a good architect like Venturi, those things can be resolved in a way that serves both sides of the wall. Here's Venturi. He says this about a facade. I would say that architecture occurs at the meeting of particular interior forces of use and space, and particular and general exterior forces of environment. Architecture, as the wall between the inside and the outside, becomes the spatial record of this reconciliation and its drama. I love this quote. This is one of the most beautiful quotations about the architectural facade. And isn't it interesting that nowhere in that quote is the word facade? In its place is the word architecture. That he is drawing an equivalence between architecture with a capital A and facade. Now, one way to think about the facade is as a projection plane. On the outside are projected those things that are relevant to the context that the facade finds itself within. On the inside are those things that are relevant to internal concerns. Those relevant to the internal concerns can find their way out to the surface of the building so that you do get some sense of internal organization, and vice versa. This is Colin Rowe, who's written extensively about the architectural facade. He says the facade is the metaphorical plane of intersection between the eyes of the observer and what one may dare to call the soul of a building. Buildings don't have souls, folks. In my facade class, every year when I use this quote, on the final exam, the student would say, the soul of the building. He's referring here to the internal animation. Now this is just an absolutely beautiful building. This is one of the Meenakshi Amman towers. There are a number of these at the site in India. It's the entrance to, it's a gateway entrance into a Hindu religious site, a spiritual site. And it consists of these wonderfully stepping towers that have built into, that encrusted onto the facade of these gateways, figurines of people, of demons, of animals, of architectural elements. The point here is that while we can appreciate this aesthetically, if you're not of this culture, if you're not Hindu, you can appreciate what it means. That this represents one of the roles that the facade has in terms of speaking to a very particular community. Charles Burroughs again says, a facade may qualify primarily as an outsurface, aesthetically and compositionally part of the street or square in which it stands, and carrying various kinds of information and cues for decoding by different interpretive communities. This is a role that these days is becoming more and more scarce, in that with globalization and with the homogenization of the environment, that all places seem to look alike, we're losing to a great extent, you know, the beauty and the richness of this kind of cultural expression through the architectural facade. An example of this, a contemporary one, a very modest building, a much more modest building, is this library that can be found a couple of hours outside of Beijing. North of Beijing in the hills is this library. And the library presents itself, the facade presents itself as this sort of reticulated surface with a balcony and a little archway on the right that leads, there are stones that pass through it. So there's a kind of stone garden that passes underneath the library, and it sits in front of this sort of reflecting pool. A close-up of the wall reveals that it's a steel, an exposed steel frame, and embedded in the wall are these twigs. The twigs were gathered locally, and they're significant to the people who live in the village nearby because these are the same twigs that they gather for their cooking purposes, for their heating purposes. And the thing that I love about this, one of the things that I particularly appreciate, is that this is designed so that as the twigs deteriorate over time, and they will decay and rot and fall away, that they can be replaced. So that in a way the building not only speaks to its relationship to the populace, it speaks to its relationship to the context, to the wooded context that it's in, but it also speaks to the cycle of decay and rebirth that one finds in the natural environment. It's a wonderful little project, and if you're curious as to what the inside looks like, it looks like this. Those twigs also serve as brise soleil. The light filters down through it. One more quotation, and this is from Michael Dennis, architect, writer, and probably one of the greatest architectural teachers that I've ever met. He recently retired from MIT. He taught for many years at Cornell. He's a longtime friend and colleague. I had lunch with him not too long ago in Boston, and it was great to see him. You may know of his book, Court and Garden. If you don't, you should become familiar with it. I would consider that a seminal text. He writes this about the facade. In the pre-modern city, represented here by Parma, the figure ground at the top, the facade mediates between the public and private realms. It is both public closure and private sign. In the modern city, represented down below by Le Corbusier's proposed plan for Saint-Denis in France, in the modern city, open space absorbs any urban idiosyncrasy, and because the street has disappeared as an enclosed space, the facade becomes only private sign rather than public closure as well. I think it's pretty clear what he's saying. Basically, when you have a fabric city, like the one you see up above, that the emphasis is on the space and the services that make that city. When you have the object city, the emphasis is on the object and not the spaces that are necessarily made around the object, or that the objects are not sufficiently in proximity to one another to give a sense of closure. Now, it's important to understand that I'm not making an argument, for somehow returning to the traditional city. As much as I like walking through places like Parma and Rome and Barcelona, I know that we can't reproduce those cities, but what we can carry forward always is the sensibility about civic space as a function of surfaces that give definition and introduce content into those spaces. If you want to see what a modern city would look like if it were actually built, you don't have to go too far, just cross the Atlantic. Excuse me, I will get to that in a moment. I'm jumping ahead here. An example, I wanted to offer you an example of a modern building in a traditional context, and there's no better one than Raphael Maneo's addition to the town hall in Murcia, Spain. In locating the facade and placing it on the other side of this space, he completes the square. Over here you can begin to make out the cathedral. This is not a project that one would take on lightly. The idea of facing off to the cathedral, which is about twice the size of the facade there. But he takes on the obligation and does it very beautifully in a very understated way, so he completes the space and sets up, in fact, in doing so, a dialogue between church and state. One of those kind of classic confrontations that you often find, in these kinds of environments. An example of a building that is not concerned with making space, but is concerned with its own objecthood and how it is perceived within the larger context, in some cases from quite a distance away, is OMA's CCTV Tower in Beijing. Now, again, I'm not suggesting that this is a bad building. I'm just saying that it doesn't have a facade and it doesn't really do much to contribute to civic space. This treatment of the landscape on the front of the building hardly, I think, qualifies as a kind of public civic plaza. If you want to see an example of what happens when you propagate the towers and the city of modern space, this is what you get. This is La Défense out in Paris. And you can see that there are few buildings that really give any sense of definition. There's a kind of vacuousness to the big plaza in the front. There are few facades in this site. It's shockingly bad in the context of the fact that just down the road, you can see the Arc de Triomphe, is the city of light, is the city of Paris. What better model would you want if you were going to make a city plan? So let's consider for a moment the analogous relationship between face and facade. The word facade comes to us from the French, which then comes to us from the Italian facciata, which means face, which comes to us from the Latin facium, which means face or appearance. And so it's only natural, it's only sort of stands to reason that one would establish equivalence between face and facade, that the analogy is an almost direct one. The organs of the face are collected together on one side of what otherwise is the orb of the head and gives kind of privileged condition to that surface. And it's this surface that we reference ourselves to, that we orient ourselves to when we are in conversation with somebody. We naturally turn to their face so that we face one another. Terms like face off and face to face and face front all implicate immediately an orientation that you have to the face or to some sort of flattened surface. There is also another aspect of the face that we don't always think about that relates directly to the facade. While we rely on the voice for the principal mean of communication between one person and another, we actually rely a lot, and in some cases much more so, on those subtle signals that are given to us by body language, by all the little muscles that can move the face into an infinite variety of expressions that give us some sense not only of what the person is saying, but what they are thinking or what they are feeling. How many times have you looked at somebody and without them saying anything to you, you say, "What's wrong?" because you see it on their face. Facades do the same thing. Shakespeare knew this, in fact, because in Macbeth, when he had King Duncan quote these words, he said, "To find the mind's construction in the face, to find the architecture's construction in the facade." Think of it that way. So what happens if I eradicate the face? If I take away the features of the face, the capacity for the face to send those nonverbal cues to me, what happens? What happens to the facade when you do that? There is a trend in recent years to do exactly that, to obliterate the face by throwing a net, a screen, a grid, a grill of some kind over the facade, over the head, as it were, or in some cases, as you see on the right, completely obliterate the face and say, "That's my facade, that's my facade." Well, I take issue with that. And here are two buildings that do exactly that. Now, I want to say two things. Number one, my critique of these buildings does not include the fact that these are good buildings in their own right, in terms of what they do and how they work. They're good buildings. My critique extends to the fact that they just don't have facades. And that's important. The other thing I want to say is, before Professor Rosa jumps out of his seat and runs up here to defend Rem, this is the last time I'm going to use Rem as an example of a bad facade. And Rem does make facades, and he makes some good facades occasionally. The building on the right is a switching tower. It, in fact, doesn't really have much of an obligation to make a facade. I think it's actually fine just the way it is. If you know this building, it's really quite exquisite in its detailing. It is, in functional terms, the reason why it looks the way it does is that it's a Faraday cage. If you know what a Faraday cage is, it's intended to sort of absorb external random electrical energy so that it doesn't disturb the electronic equipment that is on the inside of the building. It sits alongside tracks, it's an industrial building, so it doesn't really have a great obligation to make a face to the urban context. But this building does. But it doesn't have a facade. It's the same, essentially. The treatment of the skin, of the envelope, is the same on all four sides. The side that you actually enter in does not really celebrate that idea of transition. There's no real clear limit in this building. There's a little mouse hole over here. You go through it, you're inside, or you can access it, I think, that way. I have, in the interest of full disclosure, I haven't been to this building yet, so I have to restrain myself and not go overboard, because until I can actually see the building, I think I have to be careful of not being overly critical about it. But it troubles me that this is a civic structure. It is a central public library in downtown Seattle, and that the architect has decided that it doesn't need a facade, that it can be this kind of extraordinary object sitting in the context. All right, so somewhere out there must be a book that tells us what is a facade. So I've been looking for that book, and I decided to do a search recently in preparation for this presentation. And I went to that great archive of all contemporary publication, Amazon, and I did a search. And I used the search words building facade, and I got 248 hits. That was very encouraging. But I thought maybe I should refine the search, and I changed the word building to architectural. And the number dropped by about 20% to 193, so it's still very respectable. And if you spend, you could take an hour or so and go through 193 individual pages to see what's there, and I did that. And this is what I found. The first 125, 2/3, 65% of the books have little or nothing to do with the architectural facade. They are, in some cases, incidental. The staining of facades or facade access equipment. Some of them are very specific. Portuguese decorative tiles, or reading the reverse facade of Reims Cathedral, not something I'm interested in. I don't expect that in any of those I'm going to find something that tells me about the formal, tectonic, the phenomenological aspects of facade. There are some that have nothing to do with the facade at all. Decorating Texas or Life at the Dakota. My favorite is this one, Milk Run, which is about a prisoner of war. That showed up underneath the heading of architectural facade. 2/3. That leaves us with approximately 65 books. And of those 65, about 50 of them deal with the facade in almost purely technological terms. It deals with the technology of the envelope. So you have things like sustainable facades, kinetic facades, structural facades, but nothing about the facade in sort of theoretical, formal, phenomenological, tectonic terms. That leaves just about 15 books. Among those remaining 15, there are journals. like the Berlin Architectural Journal, Daedalus, and Block, which comes out of the UK, and the Cornell Architectural Journal, specifically number 3, number 6. These are in our collection upstairs. They have excellent articles in there that get at the meat of what I'm trying to find. And so I would highly recommend that you peruse those as you can. That leaves about a baker's dozen, about 12 books or so, that deal specifically with the subject in the terms that I'm interested in. One of them, Architectural Composition by Rob Creer, has a chapter devoted entirely to facades. If you go to the index, look up the word facades, you will see it in that book, as you will in these 2 books. This is Ren's book. This is done in connection with the 2014 Biennale. This is Giulia Facade, an architect, Italian architect, who wrote The Elements of Venice. There's a whole section, a beautiful section of this book that deals with the Venetian palazzo typology. These 2 books on surface architecture are excellent. This one was written by Ben Pell, an alum of Syracuse, a former student of mine. It's a great book, and it thrilled me to find this because I like to believe that the lessons of studio and the facade course rubbed off on Pell. I think they did. That leaves just 4. If you were to come to me, students among you, and say, Professor Korman, where should I go to learn about the architectural facade? I say, well, start with these 4 books. The first place would be Colin Earle's Mathematics of the Ideal Villa, which is a series of essays, and the mathematics is an iconic, it's a seminal essay. Of course, Complexity and Contradiction in Architecture, which is not necessarily about facades. He does have a chapter called The Inside and the Outside, which discusses that issue of that plane of division between inside and outside. But it's the whole sort of argument of the book, I think, is one that relates in important ways to the subject of the architectural facade. The Italian Renaissance Bottles Facade by Charles Burroughs is one of the best books on the subject of the facade, even though it deals specifically with the Italian Renaissance facade. That first chapter alone that talks in general terms about the issue of the facade, both as a vehicle for representation and as a surface for making public space, is, I think, one of the best chapters that I've ever read. And if you're going to study the facade, you're going to look at historical buildings, and if you're going to do that, you have to understand what you're looking at. So John Summerson's Classical Language of Architecture is a good place to start. These are my 4 recommendations to the students among you. There's a 5th book. If you read Italian, The Phenomenology of the Facade is an excellent book by Antonello Boschi, and you'll notice that the preface is by Charles Burroughs. So I'm really looking forward to his presentation in a couple of weeks. And there is a wild rumor that's been floating around that there is a book that's coming out hopefully soon. I'm not familiar with the author, but I understand that he shares my passion for architectural facades. This is the book that I've been looking for forever. This book doesn't actually exist. I made this image up. And it just always surprised me to think that no one has taken the opportunity, the time, to actually look at the history of architecture in terms of the history of the facade. Where histories are written and where they speak about the origins of architecture, typically it looks towards indigenous, sort of manifestations of building, but never talks about the idea that at some point in history, someone made the first facade. Even the great Gottfried Zemper, in his 4 Elements, misses the mark a little bit. I mean, he comes very close to it when he talks about the envelope and about that woven screen that you see there, but he doesn't cross the threshold and say that, well, somehow that's the beginning of facade. And maybe it's not. So in the absence of the history book, I've written my own, and I'm going to give it to you tonight. This is the first time that I'm presenting this to the public anywhere. It is Randall Korman's Brief History of the Architectural Facade in 12 buildings. What are those buildings? I can see you're on the edge of your seat. And here they are. Now, it's getting late, and I don't want to take time trying to explain everything that's here, but suffice it to say that, number one, this is not intended to be a precise longitudinal survey of the history of the architectural facade. This is more a rhetorical exercise. And what I've done is I've taken all of history and lumped it into 12 periods. So the number that you see below the images is not a date, but it represents a time frame within which there are what I would call preoccupations. So for 5,000 years, there may or may not have been a preoccupation with somehow making a mark on a wall, like the Lion Gate in the city of Mycenae, that becomes maybe the first facade. There's another 2,400 years that embraces not just Egypt, but Persia and the Mediterranean basin, where there was another kind of preoccupation with marking the vertical surface. The Greeks get about 800 years. They give it over to the Romans, which take about 500 years, and so on. I'm saying that the modern period begins perhaps with the Enlightenment and extends to World War II. I'm calling this international style or corporate modernism, which had a run for about 30 years. And postmodernism, deconstructivism, parametricism, and blob architecture. The plus after some of those time frames indicates that it's an ongoing project. Modernism is an ongoing project. Postmodernism is an ongoing project, as is decon and parametricism and so forth. What I find interesting about this is, one of the things I found interesting about this is that there is this continuous diminution of the number, except for this little bubble around the medieval and Gothic period, and I probably could have split that out into two. This number keeps going down, which suggests that there is a rate of consumption of whatever, styles or technology or formal intentionality, that is diminishing from the earliest times until we get to the more modern period where it's down to 10 years. Begging the question of what comes next. What is the next ism? And I don't know. I have a feeling that this may be the end of a certain kind of history right here, because now anything goes, anything is possible. And that's great if you're an architect. If you're a student, you probably think that that's wonderful too. I can tell you as a teacher, it's not wonderful. Because to construct a pedagogy and a curriculum, that delivers to all of you the skill sets and the knowledge and the basic foundation that you need is really difficult within the context of the seductive qualities of these kinds of investigations. So I've been doing this for 40 years, and I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues in the next few months to let them figure that out. Between all of those images that you saw, there was a gap, and that gap represents a disruption that occurred between one period and another. Something happened that created that sort of tectonic shift in sensibility, attitude, and technology, in style, in ways of representation. And many of them were fairly significant. Certainly between the Greeks and the Romans, there was a tremendous kind of shift in terms of how architecture was made and how it was used as a vehicle of representation. I would argue that the greatest shift in history occurs between, not these two buildings necessarily, but between these two periods. Between these two buildings, yes, in the sense that this is an architectural wall, and as you know, this is not an architectural wall, it's an architecture of something else. It's an architectural frame. Now, this is all news. I'm not telling any of you anything new, and I want to make it clear that you understand that this is not an invention of Le Corbusier. Sometimes we think that he invented the structural system that we see in this diagram. He didn't. Actually, it's been around for some time. In fact, you can go back to the late 18th century at a flax mill in England and see post and beam or post and brick arch construction that creates essentially the open plan, the free plan. That's 100 and some odd years before Maison Domino. Of course, Paxton's Crystal Palace was an extraordinary space that was possible because of those thin cast iron columns. And he makes a glass facade. It's not yet a free facade. It's not yet a curtain wall because the structure of the column is coincident with the glazing. The first, what is attributed to be the first curtain wall is in San Francisco in 1917, which is about the same date as the diagram. The point that I want to make is not about necessarily the free plan or even the free section that is possible here, but it's the free facade. And that is possible, at least in the diagram. It suggests that by projecting the slab, you now create a shelf that you can hang the facade from. You have detached the facade from structure. You can now hang the facade on that as though it were a curtain. Again, this is not news, but I want to make a point about that that I think is important. This is what you can do. That transparent screen that you see there can be any material that you want. You can now hang from there without any obligation to structure. All of that's handled by these thin columns. I can make a stone building, like the Flatiron building. Here it is under construction, and you can see clearly that these stone walls are being suspended off of the steel frame. You go there today, and you look at the building, it looks like a masonry building, and the stone walls are coming down to the ground, but they're not. They're hanging in the air off of the shelf of that steel frame. Or you can make an absolutely seamless glass wall and hang that like a curtain from that frame. The range of possibilities are limitless simply because of this one technological change. This, however, produces a kind of side effect that is potentially problematic. Now let me go back, let me illustrate that by taking my man here and making a kind of another anthropomorphic reference. What we have done as a result of all of that is we have detached the face from the skull. This gets a little creepy here, so hang on. The skull represents structure, whether it is steel, concrete, any kind of structure that now operates to basically hold up the building. What was an integral part of the head, the face part that was embedded within the skull, now gets detached and becomes a free plane, a free surface. It results in what I would argue, it results in what one would call the skull and the mask, where the face becomes a kind of mask. This is the title of an article by Tom Schumacher that I would recommend to everybody. It's a seminal article. And the result of that is the ambiguation of the wall. Now, if you look up ambiguation in the dictionary, it doesn't exist as a word. I've invented that word. I've adapted it from disambiguation, which means to reduce uncertainty, to eliminate uncertainty. I'm saying that by now removing the wall from structure, we've introduced a certain kind of ambiguous condition, a certain kind of ambiguity into what the nature of that wall is. Tectonically, it no longer is structure. Even though when we see a brick wall, we think structure, it's no longer structure. And that's true for most buildings these days. The walls themselves are typically curtain walls of some kind. They're rain screen walls. They're hung walls. They're not the actual structure of the building. So if I may paraphrase Magritte, this is not a brick wall. It's a representation of a brick wall. It's an image of the brick wall, but it's not the brick wall itself. If you want to see an example of that, I'll take a very good architect and a very good building. It's the IRCOM building in Paris by Renzo Piano. Because of the nature of the context, you see this historical building that's made out of brick and stone and glass. He decides to make his building a small tower on the corner out of brick. For all intents and purposes, it's a brick wall, but closer inspection reveals that the bricks are floating in space. There's no mortar in those joints. There are gaskets in there that provide the separation from one to the other. And it is not a true brick wall. Now, when I say true, I'm not speaking in ethical terms here. This is not a question of honesty in your construction. It's just that you can do this. You can float bricks and put them into a stainless steel box and then hang them, prefabricate them, and then hang them off of the wall, off of the frame, and create the appearance of a brick wall. What has happened here is an ever so slight but significant tectonic shift between one domain and the other. You change the materials from, let's say, brick to glass, and you produce a new kind of ambiguation. It's an ambiguation of surface. The quintessential example of that, of course, is Johnson's glass house, in which he reduces the structure down to just a handful of thin columns and a few mullions, and the rest of it is large surfaces of glass, thus allowing the landscape, and the intention here is to allow the landscape to move up to and through the house out the other side. That it's essentially a minimal kind of shelter that allows you to commune, to interact with the landscape in a very profound way. And in certain kinds of light, like here, that glass disappears. It's as though it were not there at all. It's a beautiful house. It's a beautiful effect. This is probably one of Johnson's best buildings. But it is not a facade. There's no facade here, folks. And that's not a critique. It's just simply an observation. There was not an intention necessarily to make a facade. The intention here was to make the walls go away, to make the facade go away. Now, if you take the glass house, which sits on 50 acres, so if you want to walk around in your jockey shorts, that's fine because your neighbors are hundreds of yards away. However, if you take the glass house and you stack it in 50 stories, like this, that creates potentially a problem in terms of the decision that you have to make between the value of your privacy versus the value of your panoramic view of your neighbor or of the Hudson, wherever your penthouse might be. I call this the treachery of the glass wall. Now, I'm not really concerned about this issue of privacy. That's a matter of choice. You decide you can afford to live in a building like this and you like living in a building like this, then more power to you. This is a matter of private choice. Where I am concerned is with this. This is a matter of public impact. This is an Amazon sales and service store in Palo Alto, California, and the entire facade has been made out of glass panels, including the mullions. Those glass fins that you see there are all glass, and a few steel clips. This is virtually the erasure. What this represents is the erasure of the facade and replacing it with a thin, transparent veil. Now, the architect of this project is Bolin Sawinski Jackson, who, following on the success of their glass cube, some of you probably, many of you may have been to New York, you've went to the Apple store on Fifth Avenue, the most popular Apple store apparently in the world, I think, and there's that glass cube. It's a remarkable sort of object. It's the logo for that store, and it represents a kind of height of glass technology that you can make a glass tube out of nothing but glass, make the stair out of glass, make the elevator out of glass. We can do this. Technology allows us to do this, but what we have to think about is the consequence of that in urban terms. Now, a more extreme example of this is this one in Oak Brook, Illinois, also done by Bolin Sawinski Jackson. Here, with just a few very large panels of glass, they've been able to make the facade basically disappear. Now, as much as we might credit them, with the technological sort of acumen that it takes to do this, where I am critical is that distinction between what is public and what is private now becomes ambiguous. It begins to get rubbery. Are you inside? Are you outside? Are you in the public domain? Or are you in the private domain? Or has the private domain now become the public domain? What's interesting is that the effect is so illusory that they even had to put up these light dots that you see here so people wouldn't walk into the glass wall. What concerns me about this is that it represents a trend in the manufacturing of other facades, particularly in storefronts and so forth, that there is a sort of washing between those two realms. And it includes even these tabletops, that they look like market stalls. So you can almost imagine that you're in an open-air market. And so I refer to this as the ambiguation of the public domain through the technology of glass. Now, Apple applied for and received trademark status for this whole idea, this ensemble. But this now belongs to Apple, this idea of a glass wall and those tables that you see in there, and this open marketplace shopping that you can do, has been trademarked by Apple. It's very, very successful, very clever, and at some level, I think there's something cynical about it as well. And it becomes even more extreme than this at the new recently completed Apple store in Chicago. In technological terms, this is an absolutely extraordinary project done by Foster and Partners. And what it is 4 thin, pencil-thin columns that are supporting an absolutely thin roof that looks like a MacBook. It was designed to look like a MacBook. So from the offices up above, you're looking down on the Apple logo. You know. But here's the thing. It's built into the embankment on the Chicago River. So it's between the Chicago River and the historic Pioneer Square up here that is up against the Tribune building. And the way that it has been configured is to, number one, make the sense of the glass wall go away. They even round the corners so that there's no intersection between 2 panes of glass to mark the corner. The corners disappear, they go away. And more to the point, they build this thing into the embankment. The stairs that you see here that are public slide through the glass and they become private. So there's a way in which you cannot distinguish between inside and outside. And you occupy the inside as though you were in a public plaza. The store is actually built, it's behind this wall, it's built underneath the park. I find this very, very troubling. As much as I appreciate it as a piece of architecture, as a building, in terms of its technology, there's something troubling about this because it's been inserted into the public domain to look like it is part of the public domain, but it's not. Very quickly, Foster did this again in the early part of his career, but in a kind of reverse way. This is the Willis Faber Dumas building in Ipswich in England. This was done in 1975. It's a private office building built at the edges of the historic center of Ipswich. And from the street, this is what you see. The walls continuously all the way around the building are wrapped in a gray tinted glass. And during the day, it reflects the context. And on clear, bright sky blue days, it reflects the context in the most sort of extreme sort of fashion, such that that surface is not the edge of the urban space. The edge of the urban space becomes the surface of the reflection, that is in virtual terms. And the context has not one of these buildings, but now 2 of these buildings. If you want to see a similar example, Jeff, in Boston, if you stand in front of the Trinity Church and you face it looking, I think, to the west, to the east, and to the right is the John Hancock Tower by I.M. Pei, you will see a reflection of Trinity Church, one of the most beautiful pieces of Romanesque architecture in the country, reflected in the wall of a private office building. So there are 2 Trinity churches, one that's real and one that's virtual. This is not a facade, folks. This is merely a kind of technological idea. And it gets even stranger because at night when they turn the lights on, the building becomes an X-ray. You know, this is not a public building. This is not even a retail building. It doesn't have shops and restaurants and so forth, which account for the reason why the lights are on. The lights are on for whatever reason, I don't know. But at night now you can look into the building when there are no people. During the day you're screened from doing that. All right. The question of abstraction. Any discussion of the contemporary trends in facade design must address the question of abstraction. Abstraction as a modus operandi within the architectural production is certainly not a modern concept. It can be seen throughout history from the pyramids to Palladio. But it was during the years of the 20th century when a new generation of European artists like Kazimir Malevich and architects like Adolf Loos took on the polemic of abstraction and with a vengeance, and 100 years later, the impact of those experiments, those earlier experiments, are now pervasive. We have come to embrace abstraction as not only a modus operandi, but something that we expect to find in the landscape. And I certainly have nothing against abstraction. I think there's a role that abstraction plays in terms of how it communicates certain kinds of ideas. But again, one has to question what happens when you bring abstraction to a point where you so empty the architecture of its sign, of its signification, of its content, that you're left with just basically syntax. The historical tension between the need for figuration and the will towards abstraction is well known, and I won't try to rehash the arguments here. Here are two buildings that are at opposite ends of the spectrum of abstraction. On the left, Gaudi's Casa Batlló, and on the right, Wittgenstein House by the architect Paul Engelmann, a student of Otto Floss, working in close collaboration with the Viennese philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein. The historian and art critic Alfred Barr, Jr. referred to these two types of abstraction as near abstraction and pure abstraction. Near abstraction arises out of the natural world, and pure abstraction from the conceptual and metaphysical realm. In philosophical terms, both concepts of abstraction present difficulties requiring that they yield to a third notion that abstraction, particularly within the domain of architecture, is an unstable concept that invariably hovers between the idealized state of pure abstraction, that which is unequivocally concrete, and that which is unequivocally concrete. Never able to achieve an absolute state of abstraction. By virtue of its functional role, material presence, and physical context, architectural abstraction is bound to always operate within this third realm in an ever compromised sort of state. This is a kind of unresolved, I think, issue within architecture, and it's something that I think probably requires much further study. But what does it mean when we bring that degree of abstraction, like you see in the Wittgenstein house, or maybe more so here, into the public domain? If you're designing a house for yourself, that's fine. You can make it as abstract as you like. This is a housing for the elderly in Spain. It startles me that this was built and that it is as successful as it is. Now, I'm not being critical here. I guess I'm reacting more as an American architect than anything else, but can you imagine something like this being built in the United States for the elderly? I mean, what we build for the elderly is something that is usually close to a log cabin or an urban palazzo, but this kind of abstraction is just sort of extraordinary. But it says something about Spanish culture and the culture of Europe that it's much more responsive and much more accepting of this kind of abstraction. Here's another view of this building. I think it's just really extraordinary. I had the opportunity recently to see the Diller Scofidio Renfrew Broad Museum in Los Angeles not too long ago, and it's just a stunning building. It's a wonderful building. And what's wonderful about it is that it pushes the envelope in terms of how abstract a facade can be and still be a facade. Now, what you're seeing is this screen that they've created, this beautiful screen that they've created. And without the presence of that window, I would say this is not a facade. The idea that they've inserted this one element of representation, behind that is a conference room, that relieves this side from being the same as the others. The others are like this, but do not have the cyclops, the eyeball in the center. That, and the fact that it fronts on the street and it contributes to making the space of the street, allows it, as austere as it is, to qualify as a facade. And there's more going on here as well. As you approach it, you realize that it has this sort of oblique aspect that reminds one of Colin Rowe's article on contrapposto, and he calls contrapposto a preference for frontality and a subsidiary pleasure in the delights of the oblique view. I love that quote. But what of this? This is a music hall in Spain. Spain again. Those Spanish architects are extraordinary. This is a wall of iridescent tiles with a door in it. Can we call this a facade? I think we could debate it, but if we say that it is, it brings the definition of facade and what qualifies a facade down to an absolutely sort of minimalist state. It's a kind of minimalism that we would associate with the work of Don Judd, the minimalist artist Don Judd. I don't know how much more abstract one can get than this. But I'm not showing you the whole building. What you need to understand is that there's a context here that not only allows the abstraction, but informs the abstraction in some interesting ways. The actual front of this building is an older building that it is attached to. So that sets up a kind of dialogue, a dialectic between the traditional character of the older building and the austere, reductive character of the new building. But the one thing that I really love about this is the context that it's set within. Just up the hill is a quarry, and there are these huge blocks of stone that are about the same size as this building. And so there is, in other words, you have to move around this building and through it to really appreciate how it's operating within its context. And as Tom Schumacher would say, context is all. Change the context and you change the meaning. Now, very quickly, let me sort of begin to wrap it up here. Within the context of abstraction, there is a subcategory that I call the anti-facade. These are buildings that very purposely, deliberately try to eliminate the facade or create a facade that begins to defy the very rules and prescriptions of what a facade should be. Two of them that I would use to illustrate that would be Sana's New York City New Museum and Enrique Norton's Hotel Americano, which is on the west side overlooking the Hudson Yards. Both of these very deliberately have scraped free from the surface any reference, to anything extraneous, reducing it down to, in both cases, these are steel screens. This is a stainless steel woven fabric, and this is a sort of expanded metal mesh that they've painted white. The way these things succeed, the way these buildings actually, I think, succeed, and the way they're able to sort of hold their own as facades, still qualify, is that they're borrowing from the context. That the Enrique Norton building can be this austere because the context is as normative as it is. So think of the Guggenheim Museum as being this sort of alien object that can be accommodated by the context of the space that it sits within on Fifth Avenue. This building does the same thing, although in this case, it steps back so that it is making an accommodation to the context through that sort of cornice line, that there is a plane, a surface, a volume that is forward that establishes a kind of scale of the base, and then it sort of stacks up from there. So you're not aware of the actual mass of the building when you're on the street. And here are other buildings that are anti-facades. Some, I think, succeed, others perhaps not. And within that category, anti-facade, there is a subcategory that I would call the parasitic facade, where these are buildings that are attached to, or in some cases look like they are violating, they are actively in combat with other buildings, but they draw their energy, their dialectic from that confrontation. These are two Libeskind buildings. Of course, this is a recently completed Zaha building. I don't know what to say about these. I mean, at some point, you have to draw the line and say, no, it just doesn't work. Nor does this one. This landed from orbit somewhere, and hopefully it's not going to stay too long. I won't go into a rant about this, but this kind of stuff just drives me crazy. And in the context of all this criticism that I've been leveling at some of these buildings, I think it's only fair that I show you three buildings that I think really represent the best practices of facade making, and they range quite widely from the abstract to the representational. The first one is a Jewish community center and synagogue in Mainz, Germany. It's on a site where the original synagogue was destroyed during the war, and it is a series of surfaces that are like an abstract piece of sculpture. It's slightly cubistic, that are collected together, appearing almost as separate pavilions that are marching around, forming a sort of space in front of it, a public space in front of it. The back side of this building faces onto a street, and so that curvature, that wrapping that you see there is actually precipitated by the property line of a curving street that is behind this building. The skin, the envelope, is made up of these ceramic rods, bars that you see there that that are colored with a certain kind of material that changes color in different kinds of light. It's really quite exquisite. But the sort of hidden factor that requires that you sort of uncover it, it's there to be discovered, is the fact that the profile of both the section and the facade is a function of these 5 Hebrew letters that you see here. Each one is a kind of generator, is reinterpreted as a profile of a space. And that profile that you see there is also the profile of the facade. The 5 letters taken together spell the word kadusha in Hebrew, which means to lift up or to bless. And so embedded within the facade is that message to be discovered. Here's a concert hall in Szczecin, Poland, which is again done by a Spanish architectural team, although Spaniards get around. This is an extraordinary building that is made up, the bulk of it is made up of a series of towers that are like medieval towers, such as the one that you see next to the first one over here. This is a typology that can be found in the city. The architects took that typology and built a facade as a continuous set of these townhouses. The skin, the outer envelope, is made up of these thin fins that you see there in front of a glass wall. This is the insulating layer here. There's lighting inside there so that at night it looks like that. A building that I had a chance to visit a few years ago is the Ningbo History Museum in Ningbo, China, a very important, very old port town. That the building sits on a site that is between the harbor and some hills, mountains that are in the distance. And the building is acknowledging that through its rough landscape sort of conformation, and the fact that the reflecting pools speak to the harbor that's nearby. This is the way you enter it, through this cave-like structure, but it's the skin of the building, the outer layer, that is really extraordinary. Where its concrete is exposed, you see the formwork of the bamboo, locally harvested, that was used to impart this sort of scallop treatment of the outer surface. The rest of the building is covered with gray and red bricks and tiles, roof tiles, that were recovered, that were repurposed after a series of old villages or old neighborhoods were torn down. This is part of this sort of campaign to sort of modernize China, where, as you know, many historic neighborhoods have been lost to the bulldozer. Well, Wan Shu, the Pritzker Prize winning architect who did this building, it's an extraordinary building, made a point of recovering those tiles. So there is an issue of kind of sustainability here, the repurposing of the tiles, the recycling of the tiles. But more to the point, I think there is a political statement that's being made. This is a kind of silent and continuing protest against that process of uncontrolled, almost, destruction of the patrimony of architecture that has been going on in China for many years. Here is a wall that speaks, truth to power in saying that this needs to stop, and that he's made a beautiful architecture out of that sort of political statement. And finally, I'm occasionally asked, what is the future of the facade? And my answer is, I haven't got a clue. The technology is moving apace at such a rate that it's hard to tell what's going to happen. I can tell you, that there's an enormous amount of money and research that's being folded into the technology of the facade. So all of you, all the students among you, will have extraordinary opportunities and means available to you when you leave this place and go out and make your own buildings. I might offer just a few observations. One of them is, I think it was Greg Lynn that said the future is going to be gelatinous. And I guess he meant by that the future is going to be this. And if this is going to be the future, of architecture, then it's a future without facades. Now, I'm being a little critical here, although I've been to some of these buildings and they're quite interesting, but they don't make facades, they don't make public space, they occupy space. So one has to imagine, what would a city look like that was made out of this kind of architecture? Well, it's probably Disney's Tomorrowland idea of what a city would look like. If you look carefully, there are no facades anywhere in this landscape. And if you look really carefully, there are no people in this landscape. What I do know is that cities are going to get bigger. We all know, you all know that recently, a few years ago, we crossed that threshold where 50% of the population of the world now lives in or near an urban center. By 2050, it is estimated that 70% of the world's population is going to be in cities. So our cities are going to get bigger, or we're going to have to start building some new ones. All of you are going to have lots of work to make those cities larger. I'm telling you, I'm pleading with you to make them better, make civic spaces in those cities. Don't get seduced into making object buildings. One of the issues that we confront now and that all of you have to deal with is this one of globalization, which has given us great benefits, but it has also resulted in homogenization of the environment. You've traveled enough to know that you can go from one city to another, the city center, and not feels like you've gone anywhere, that everything is becoming more and more alike. So I think this question of critical regionalism is the kind of important one that has to be taken up in the studios, within the curriculum of the school. Everything that I've said up to this point is irrelevant. So you can forget what I've said as long as you concentrate on the fact that probably the single greatest factor affecting all of you, all of us, the globe as a whole, is climate change. Now, there are people who will try to tell you that it's not as serious as you think it is, or worse yet, they will try to tell you that it's a hoax. It is very, very serious. What I know about it is that within the lifetime of the young people in this room, you will see some of the significant effects of climate change. Buildings are complicit, have been for a long time, in contributing to the problem. Buildings will be contributory to solving that problem, but you need to design those buildings. And where that is going to happen in large part is going to be in the envelope of the building. The cities are going to get greener, not just metaphorically, but literally they're going to get greener. You will see vegetative and facades becoming more and more the norm. The roofs of buildings are going to become green. We need to green the landscape. This project over here that you see, the tower, is a proposal by Danny Libeskind, and I'm hoping when he comes at the end of the semester that he will talk about that. That's a 900-foot building that has these gardens in it where if you live in this building, you can grow your own food inside the building. Facades will be designed to harvest energy from the sun, from the wind. Facades like this one on the end will be our design. This is a housing project in Denmark where the material of the skin is impregnated with a chemical, with titanium dioxide, which when exposed to UV light interacts with pollutants in the air and converts them to salts, and it washes away. So facades will literally scrub the air. They will refresh the air. Materials like this homeostatic metals that you see here will be autonomous and respond to the presence of light and heat. Facades will become much more kinetic and will be operated by artificial intelligence in ways that we can only begin to imagine right now. They will become highly sort of responsive. Facades will become such that there will be 3D QR codes in them so that you can interact with a facade through some handheld device. This is not too far off. This is happening already, this kind of augmented reality. If you want to see an example of an interactive facade, you just go to downtown Manhattan. There is this glass facade, 550 feet long, designed by Hanrahan and Myers, that they've commissioned a composer to create a score that is in keeping with the program of this building, which is swimming pools and water and so forth. It's a community center. And that piece of music was transcribed into a series of frits that were etched into the wall. You take your smartphone, download an app, and then that reads the wall, and you walk along and you listen to that composition. And this is what you hear. I hope this works. All right, finally, I want to say something about media facades. If you've been to Times Square, or if you've been to Shibuya Crossing in Tokyo, and to other downtown entertainment commercial centers in any city, you've seen media facades. They've been around for a long time. A media facade basically is the application of some lighting technology, projection technology, into the facade of the building such that the facade becomes literally the message in some ways. Now, these facades that have been around for some time are developing into the technology development such that they are becoming, first of all, very affordable. They use LED technology and so forth that is relatively cheap to operate. And they're becoming more ubiquitous. They're moving outside of these entertainment and commercial centers. And you will find them now in museums, in apartment buildings, in office buildings, in boutiques, in concert halls. They're becoming much more and more ubiquitous. This concerns me only to the extent that it is another intrusion, onto the civic domain. And it raises questions as to what do we get from creating these kind of hyperactive environments. Now, I want to end with a little clip from the movie, A Ghost in the Shell. You may have seen this film. It's sort of interesting. It's like Blade Runner. It depicts a dystopian view of a future city, but it's a dystopian view of a city that is suffused by media facades and projection environments. And it depicts, in some cases, a holographic technology that is being developed as we speak. So although I'm much more optimistic than this image shows, I want you to see this anyway. And let me say this. However, since technology almost always trumps tradition, we need to be concerned about these things. Not just this, but a lot of the things that I've said tonight. The technological advances that are currently being made in the building envelope will undoubtedly change the nature of the architectural facade and impact the character of the urban environment. The important question is, how will these new environments change us?
Instructions.
My sentiments exactly. For the students among you, my advice is this, is review the literature that exists on the architectural facade. Consider the principles, the practices, the ideas that are suggested, and use that to make good facades. And then report the results of what you found to your sensei, to your teacher, and have a good conversation about it. I'm going to leave you with one last quote. This is my favorite, and it's from Colin Rowe. The vertical surface can only remain the threshold of understanding. For while the plan, as a document addressed to the mind, will always be the primary concept, the vertical surface as a presentation addressed to the eye will always be the primary percept, will never be other than the beginning of comprehension. Thank you. I think we should go straight to the... Thank you.